And then all of a sudden, she started pointing at, all of a sudden she's kind of awake, and she's pointing at the ceiling, and she's trying to lift herself up, and she reaches out and grabs my wrist. I mean, and she had a grip you would not imagine for a woman who'd been laying in a bed for months. And she's trying to show me something that she's seeing on the ceiling, and which, of course, I didn't see. But she was like that for a good little while. And finally, she just fell back, exhausted. And then she was non-responsive again. And so then later that night, around midnight, she passed. And she had been, it was so striking, and what was particularly striking to me was that my mother was, in her best years, was an agnostic. In many other years, which did not even reach that level. She was very hostile, by and large, to the idea of religion. She thought that the upbringing that she'd received when she was a child, had been very bad. And so she wasn't like a natural candidate for something like this. But it did make me think that there is, well, God doesn't forget anyone, I don't believe, when you get right down to it. So DeGraff then goes on and she says, well, look, this is what really it means. And we sometimes hear this, right? Hippies say this. I used to say this when I was a hippie, and that is, you got to just be, man, right? And to be, presumably, it's kind of hard to define, but presumably to be your authentic self, as opposed to some other thing. And so DeGraff speaks about this, and so does Metropolitan Anthony, where they talk about the idea of being as opposed to what they call, what they would think of as doing. In other words, your constant activity. You're always doing this. You go to work, you do this, you do that. You have to go over here and do this and do that. And then it's like bedtime again. And the next morning you get up and you go do this and you do that. And there's no time to kind of get within yourself. And to have this experience of simply being quiet, being within yourself and starting to understand yourself, and then more importantly, starting to understand God. And so we have this thing. And so there's a story in here that I think was particularly, well, they're all good, but it's a Metropolitan Anthony story, where a man went into hospice, Alexander. He doesn't have long to live. He has cancer of the liver, and it's pretty advanced. And so he knows what's going to happen. And he complained to Vladika. He said that he's had so much to do, but now now he doesn't have anything to do, and he doesn't know what to do. And so Metropolitan Anthony simply reminded him that he had always been frustrated by his inability to make time stand still. Now God had done exactly that for him. And then the Metropolitan started spending a lot of time with him, looking over what was not yet, quote, quite right, unquote, not yet resolved deeply in Alexander's soul. And they spent a lot of time talking about these things. Well, this is often something we also see in another thing, in the sense of forgiveness and in the sense of guilt that we may feel. Because those are kind of bookends, if you will. If we have guilt over something that we have done, and you know, oftentimes it doesn't take something big to leave kind of a guilty feeling with a person. If they feel like they let somebody down, or they feel like they said something and then later they regretted saying it, and they're afraid that they may have hurt a person by what they have said, this person may be the only person that remembers that this person has some guilt about what they did. And that guilt can contribute to not being able to come to grips with what's happening, because the guilt simply overcomes everything else you have. Well, it's the same way with a lack of forgiveness. A lot of times people say they forgive, but they haven't really forgiven. And nobody can tell that except that person. And so a lot of times people, they carry around kind of a grudge against somebody. They go, I am really, in their mind, they're going, I'm really been out of shape at that person. That person should not have done that. He did me wrong. I haven't done it, all this kind of stuff. I was always good. I did this, whatever. doesn't make any difference. Because this is the bookend to guilt. If on the one hand we are sorry and we cannot overcome the idea that we have hurt somebody and we've never dealt with that adequately, this is the other hand, which says, I am not willing to do anything to overcome this gulf, to overcome what's going on with this. And so it becomes this really, really difficult thing. And this is what Metropolitan Anthony kept telling people. He said, look, you have some time, and the most productive use you can make of your time is simply to go through your mind and clear these things out, to ask forgiveness, to do all of the things that have to happen. You know, in the Middle Ages, and there's some reference to this in the Philippe Aries book, there's this notion that, you know, and I think it's because that life was somewhat slower then. There wasn't TV to like distract you or anything. But people, as they got closer to death or got older, they would start to realize that death was coming. And then they would start to have this notion, they'd go through this examination, and because people were religious then, and they would start thinking, you know, my soul isn't really where it needs to be. And so they would start, if they could still do it, they would travel to go see other people. If not, they'd ask that person to come and see them, and they'd say, please forgive me. Whatever I said, whatever I did, please forgive me for what I did. And it became this way of people cleansing themselves before they die. And this is something that we should also take care of. And we should also see as something that we should do. But we shouldn't wait. We're not going to be like the hospice people. I mean, only relatively few people die in hospices. More people die, you know, just in a sudden death from, you know, vaccines or traffic or whatever. More people yet die of a heart attack that comes on them unknown. And there's no time for this. So when we think about ourselves, we don't have time to say, I'll think about forgiving so-and-so later on. I'll think about asking for forgiveness from so-and-so later on. What happens if we don't have time? What happens if we just die? What happens if we have a heart attack and keel over and we have never done these things? That's not going to be a good thing. And so we have this understanding that this is something that is on us. We did the sin. It's up to us to ask forgiveness if that affected somebody else. And so that becomes something that is really important. Nobody really, I don't want to say that, but it's hard for people to come to grips with that. Because oftentimes when they think back about some argument or something like that, their recollection has more to do with the other person. We don't often see ourselves with clarity about these things. We see the other side of clarity, and they're dogs, and we really hate those people. But we don't look at ourselves with clarity. That becomes something that we really have to do in preparation, not only for our own death, but in preparation for our appearance in front of the throne. If Jesus, you know, when the judge is there, I think that the judge will probably say, why didn't you ever say I'm sorry? Why did you hold this grudge? Why did you do that? And from the scripture, we know that people aren't going to have any words to say because they'll recognize the rightness of that. It'll simply be that thing. And so for Metropolitan Anthony and also for Frankl, who did the same thing in the concentration camps with the Jews in those camps, they both addressed this. They said, look, guilt stands in your way. And they would encourage people to go and to cleanse themselves of that guilt by asking for forgiveness or whatever the case may be. There was she quotes Metropolitan Anthony on page 23. She says, it's extremely necessary to prepare for one's death by a severe but freeing process of reconciliation with everyone, with oneself, one's conscience, one's circumstances, with the present and the past, with events, also in relation to people, and even with the future and the coming of death itself. It is impossible to enter eternity when one is entangled in hatred, in a state of unrest. Both the dying person and the one still left behind on earth need to be able to say from the depth of their heart, "Forgive me, and then I do forgive you." This is really important stuff. It's really important for all of us to look at our own life with clear eyes, with a clear understanding of what we have done or not done, as the case may be. Nobody really wants to say that they were wrong. Nobody wants to say the other person was right. But it's not so much a question of who's wrong and who's right. It really isn't. Probably in most of these things, both sides were both wrong and right. If you were to really knock all these things down. And so we have this notion about the way to approach this. And this is a difficult thing. And I think what we're reading in Ms. DeGraff's book and the stories that she talks about, what many of them really deal with is this notion, this idea that people facing death suddenly have this realization that when that time comes, that's it. There is no more there's no more of a chance to change things. There's no more of a chance to make things right. There's no more chance. There's no more opportunity to do the things that our Lord himself would insist that we do. And so for Metropolitan Anthony, for Vladika, it became a very huge matter that this forgiveness be both extended and accepted. In a sense, we do this at Forgiveness Sunday every year, and sometimes people aren't happy with Forgiveness Sunday. My own experience with this is that even though Forgiveness Sunday could, if you looked at it in one way, simply be kind of mechanical, right? I mean, you go up, you say the words, the other person says a word, you say the word, they say the words, they go to the next person. But I've never been at any time as a priest or as anybody, as any other capacity, where people weren't like